Welcome back everyone to another reaction video. Well, there have been a number of channels that have cropped up over the last couple of years that you can tell are definitely influenced by other successful history channels. There are channels that model themselves after Oversimplified or after Salmonella Academy and things like that. And this is one of those channels that you can definitely tell has been heavily inspired by the likes of Salmonella Academy. This is Serious History. They have 196,000 subscribers. And I was just browsing through some of the available content on the channel, and I thought this one looked kind of interesting. It's got 500,000 views. It's called Disturbing Facts About Historical Figures. So again, it's just an opportunity to look at kind of a plethora of stories from history with a common theme running through them. So I'll put the link down in the description so that you can go over and check out Serious History's channel and see all the other content that they have available. But let's go ahead and dive into this one.
This list is something, so let's just get right into it.
Something.
Number 1, Mozart. So we're starting this list with Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, one of the greatest composers in the history of music.
Yeah.
Chances are, even if you're not a fan of classical music, you've probably heard at least a few of his songs. I'm playing one in the background right now. But did you know that in addition...
Sounds like Ein klein Nachtmusik is playing in the background. Got to go to Vienna on our group trip that we did last fall, and about a year ago now. And we got to hear Mozart being played in Vienna. It was really, really something. There are a lot of these classical pieces, unless you are somebody who is really into those things or has studied them, you're very familiar with the music because it gets used in all sorts of different ways in our culture, but you might not be familiar with what it's called or who it's composed by. But I guarantee that Mozart is one of those people that has written a lot of the music that we're all very familiar with.
Into banging out over 800 legendary compositions, Mozart also wrote a few songs about licking holes. That's right, songs, as in multiple songs about licking holes. But first, let's rewind a bit to try to explain why. Born in 1756, Mozart was one of the earliest examples of a child prodigy.
Yep.
He excelled in both piano and violin, and was composing and performing in front of royalty at the age of 5. For context, my greatest accomplishment at the age of 5 was putting on my Crocs all by myself. And
they were on backwards.
Mozart was out there playing the piano in front of the kings and queens of Europe. Pretty much the same thing if you ask me, but anyways. At the age of 17, he became an official musician of the Salzburg court in the Holy Roman Empire, where he composed some of his most critically acclaimed masterpieces. Now, I'm telling you all of this because there's this modern-day theory that child stars stop mentally maturing at the age they become famous.
Huh.
And this may have been the case for Mozart as well, as he was...
I could see that a little bit, and if you've seen the movie Amadeus, which is kind of loosely based on him, you see some of that. But yeah, I mean, you go to Salzburg even today. Salzburg's a really cool town, by the way. It's real close to the... it's in Austria, but it's real close to... the German town of Berchtesgaden, which has a lot of World War II history, but it's just a really cool town. It's got Hohensalzburg, it's a big fortress that's one of the largest castles in Europe, and it dominates the landscape. A really, really neat place to visit if you ever get the chance.
It's very into things like butts and poop and balls. Just like your typical kindergartner, he thought these things were hilarious. In love letters to his cousin, yeah, don't ask, we find quotes like, "I wish you good night, shit in your bed all your might," and "I shit on your nose so it runs down your chin."
What?
And you might say, well,
What?
at the peak of his fame, the dude was still a teenager. These letters were written when he was in his 20s. The guy just loved talking about poop. There are at least 40 preserved letters written by Mozart where he talks about pooping, or butts, or some other weird thing. And he didn't just keep it between friends and family. He even composed pieces for the general public to tell everyone that he really liked holes. The most well-known of Mozart's dirty ditties was the beautiful choral piece for 6 voices Lech mich im Arsch, or Lick Me in the Ass, with lyrics that speak to, well, getting licked in the
Oh, baby.
Here's a snippet from the English translation.
This is blowing my mind. I had no idea that this was the case. No idea.
Lick me in the quickly, quickly. Lick me in the quickly. Now, what I find most hilarious about all this is you can actually go and watch videos of serious classical singers dressed up in suits and ties singing Lick Me in the
baby.
on YouTube. It's almost as if Mozart knew that if he wrote it, people would be singing this song about licking holes for hundreds of years.
Leck mich Im Arsch. What? You want to see a funny performance about a topic that is presented in a serious way, but is actually really like hilarious and not meant to be taken seriously? I'm sure most of you have already seen it, but if you haven't, you have to look up the song about Shia LaBeouf. It will change your life. That's all I'm saying. Continue.
Years. Some other translated lyrics from a few other of Mozart's ass-focused bangers include "Stick your to your mouth," "Oh, lick me real quick in the," and maybe my personal favorite, "It is difficult to lick my and." You said it, Amadeus.
I had no idea this is where this video was going to go. My life will never be the same.
We've all tried, and it is difficult, you genius prodigy, you. Number 2. Thomas Edison. Many people know of Thomas Edison as the genius inventor behind things like the incandescent light bulb, the phonograph, and the kinetoscope.
Listen, here's the thing. You guys know that I love to praise Ohio and all things Ohio and all people from Ohio, but I can acknowledge that Thomas Edison, while he had a significant role in many things that we use to this day, not necessarily did he go about it in the right way.
Name a few. But not many people know just how power-hungry and downright cruel Edison really was. Edison was an ego-driven, cutthroat businessman who went to extreme lengths to make as much money as possible.
But he was also living in a time when being an ego-driven, cutthroat businessman was the way that a lot of people were getting ahead. That's not a justification, but he's hardly the only one, and he saw other people doing this and went down the same path.
Even went as far as publicly electrocuting animals to try to put his competitors out of business. But before
the current wars, there's actually been movies and documentaries about the current war between AC and DC.
Let's start with his accidental creation of Hollywood. One of Edison's favorite activities was suing other people when they didn't pay him to use his inventions. When he and his partner created the first movie camera and movie projector, he opened America's first movie production studio in 1893, dubbed the Black Maria, in West Orange, New Jersey. Shortly after opening the Black Maria, he formed the Motion Picture Patents Company, a trust, nicknamed, surprise, surprise, the Edison Trust, which contained his production company as well as all of his major competitors, who, by that time, were all on the brink of failure due to constantly being sued by Edison. Through this trust, he then began to sue anyone and everyone who tried to make movies without paying him first. Because of the sheer amount of patents the trust held, it became virtually impossible for anyone to make movies on the East Coast without paying Edison a hefty sum or getting sued. As a result, independent filmmakers opted to get as far away from Edison as possible. With its cheap land and abundant labor, Hollywood, California was the best and furthest option. And the rest is history.
That's crazy.
So Hollywood essentially was created because independent filmmakers were like, I gotta get the f*** away from this guy.
And that's not an unreasonable thing to have wanted to do, given how Thomas Edison was known to practice business.
Moved the entire movie industry across the country to do so. Anyways, surprise, surprise, the Edison Trust was shut down in 1915 after losing an antitrust monopoly court case. Shocking. But speaking of shocking, that brings us to our next horrific Edison story. As America industrialized, there were two competing methods to bring electricity to the masses: direct current and alternating current, or DC and AC electricity, respectively. Edison favored and invested heavily into direct current systems, where voltage stays constant, flowing in a single direction, while Westinghouse, a competitor, promoted alternating current, where the current periodically changes direction. While alternating current proved more effective at transferring electricity over long distances, Edison, unsurprisingly given his investments in direct current systems, claimed it was volatile and far too dangerous. To prove this, he went to extreme lengths to smear the public perception of AC electricity. Edison began to hold public displays where he would gather a crowd and then electrocute animals with alternating current as a way to demonstrate how dangerous it was.
And part of this is him understanding that he needed to get out in front of all of this and shape public perception. Part of it is a recognition probably that his competitors were not willing to go to the same lengths to shape public perception. So he was really fighting a one-sided battle in terms of getting out there and trying to get everyone's minds focused on the idea that DC is safe, DC is the way to go, AC is dangerous. And this was a real fear people had. Remember that when electricity is first put into the White House, you have the president unwilling to touch light switches for fear of being electrocuted. Something that you and I take for granted, touching a light switch and flipping it. But at that time, it was new technology and people didn't understand it fully and they had a lot of questions.
Edison fried mostly stray cats and dogs. But on one occasion, when the Coney Island Zoo decided that they needed to put down an unruly elephant, Edison jumped on the opportunity. In 1903, in front of a crowd of 1,500 people, Edison electrocuted Topsy the elephant to prove his point, even filming the incident to have it live on forever. Don't Google it, it's messed up.
Yeah.
Ultimately, while the stunt was successful in killing Topsy, it did little to stop the growing popularity of alternating current systems. And eventually, AC electricity became the widespread standard that powers the majority of the world today.
And this is also at a time, early 1890s, where you're going to have Auburn State Prison in New York do the first execution by electric chair. It was a guy named William Kemmler who had... I think Tilly Ziegler was his girlfriend or his fiance or something, and he had killed her with an axe. And they didn't really fully understand how to use the technology yet, and they basically cooked the guy to death. It was brutal.
3. Henry Ford.
Another
Henry
winner.
Ford, founder of the Ford Motor Company, is one of the most influential businessmen in U.S. history. But did you know he was also a huge racist who was praised by even Hitler himself?
Goodbye.
Ford's introduction of the Model T automobile and pioneering of the assembly line technique completely changed the world.
And this is just a reminder that people can do great things without being great people. Or they can have certain characteristics that are great, but they can still be lousy human beings at the same time.
Revolutionizing both manufacturing and transportation in America. Serving as the sole owner of his company, Ford was one of the richest and most respected men of his time, and a shining example of capitalism at its finest. However, while Ford was a shining example of capitalism, he was also the shining example of a huge racist dick. Starting off, Ford's factories practiced your standard racial segregation of the time.
Yeah.
Ford felt that black people were inherently inferior to whites, and his black workers were unable to be promoted or to hold any sort of executive position. They usually worked only in the forge and foundry of the factories, the most dangerous positions in the company.
And remember, this is, this is even the federal government under people like Woodrow Wilson segregated jobs, civilian jobs, but even in the military up until Harry Truman is president, you've got segregation among the military, and you have certain jobs that, especially early on in World War II, were not going to black soldiers. They ended up cooks, and they ended up driving trucks, and they ended up doing all the things that didn't give them prominent positions of leadership on the front lines. Now, that did start to change, but in a segregated way. But this was the norm for many people in the country.
He also publicly supported organizations like the KKK. But Ford's treatment of black people pales in comparison to his utter hatred of Jews.
Yep.
Ford was a loud and proud anti-Semite who invested almost as much energy into creating anti-Jewish propaganda as he did growing his automobile company. He believed a racist conspiracy theory that Jews controlled the world's labor unions, banks, and media, and because of his wealth and success, his words held a lot of weight around the world. Ford believed that Jewish people were out to get him, so much so that he purchased a struggling newspaper to begin running a weekly series titled The International Jew, The World's Problem, on the paper's
The world's foremost problem. And who else was saying the same kind of stuff? Well, a mustached man from Austria in Europe.
Page. Subtle. The International Jew articles were collected into booklets and published in post-World War I Germany. And
right, I'm going to say it. Look at the date of this. This is October 1920. This is right at the beginning of the rise of National Socialism in Germany. And listen, if you've never done it, there are YouTube videos that translate many of you-know-who's speeches into English, so that you can watch him speaking but hear it in English. And I'm telling you right now, it's scary, But it's also really fascinating because when you listen to the arguments, when we watch it in German, and I understand some German, but I can't follow every word that he's saying. But when you don't speak the language and you just see this guy spouting German, he just looks like a madman. But when you listen to him talk, I'm not saying he's right at all, because he certainly was not. But you can understand how he was able to convince people that he was right. He was very compelling. He's very well spoken. He is presenting it in a compelling way that you can see why, when you have a market for this set of ideas, why people could so easily get sucked into that.
Heavily influenced many young Germans who saw Ford as a successful and powerful American. There are documented cases of Nazi officials saying that it was Ford's publications that convinced them that Hitler and the Nazi ideology were right. Speaking of Hitler, he was also a huge fan of Ford's work, and even mentioned him by name in Mein Kampf as a single great man. Hitler was known to keep a photo of Ford, as well as copies of the International Jew, in his office for inspiration. In 1938, Germany awarded Ford the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest Nazi award that can be given to anyone not of German descent, which he happily accepted. Henry Ford died in 1947, taking his anti-Semitic beliefs with him. And in 2014, Ford Motor Company appointed its first Jewish CEO in Mark Field.
That's awesome. I love the fact that that happened.
Number 4. Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great is widely recognized as one of history's greatest and most accomplished military commanders and warriors. But what most people don't know is that once he got so drunk during a banquet that he ended up killing one of his best friends.
Oh, no!
After taking the throne at the age of 20, following the assassination of his father, Philip II, Alexander spent the majority of his reign successfully conducting large-scale military campaigns throughout Asia and Egypt. And by the time he was 30, Alexander had accumulated not only a super legit KDA, but also one of the largest empires in the history of the world.
And, we look at these maps and...
Not only a super legit KDA, but also one of the largest empires in the history of the world.
We look at maps like this, and because now we understand the scope of the world and we know the full extent of it, and we have a very connected world, and so the world feels smaller than it ever did before. We have to remember how massive an undertaking this was and what a large amount of territory this is at a time when most of this space is probably empty. You have cities and you might have some nomads and some little villages here and there, but most of this space is empty, and he had to march over hundreds and even thousands of miles. And he brought an empire all the way from Greece to the doorstep of modern-day India. It's incredible.
Stretching from Greece to northwestern India. But who was this friend he killed and why? Well, Cletus the Black was an officer who initially...
Wait, his name can't really have been Cletus. Really? Really?
served as an army commander under Philip II, a position that he retained when Alexander took the throne. He was a trusted military advisor, and in the Battle of Granicus in 334 BCE, as Alexander was being assailed by two Persian warriors, Cletus saved the king by severing the arm of one of the Persians before the enemy could deliver the killing blow. By all accounts, Cletus was an extremely valuable asset and a good friend to Alexander, but ultimately not enough of a friend to, not murder.
So, Cleitus was the way his name was spelled, Cletus. My mind is blown in this video with things I didn't know.
In 328 BCE, Alexander was holding a banquet, and it was during this banquet that he and Cletus got into a heated argument which ultimately turned deadly. While the particulars of the night's events vary from author to author, what all sources agree on is that both men were extremely drunk. That night, Alexander announced a reorganization of his military commands, and Cletus specifically got the short end of the stick when he was ordered to lead a group of 16,000 defeated mercenaries to Central Asia, which he viewed as a massive demotion. He would go from commanding one of the most revered cavalries in the world to leading a group of losers into the middle of nowhere. He called BS, and then things got wild. Cletus began voicing his opposition to the plan, which began to upset Alexander. Then, Cletus added fuel to the fire by claiming that Alexander was not the legitimate king, and that all of his achievements were only made possible by his father, the slain Philip II.
This is why you don't get drunk, because you lose that ability to have a little bit of check on yourself and some self-control that could otherwise keep you from getting into these kinds of situations.
Sick burn. Anyways, some back and forth and a few more insults from Cletus, Alexander got so pissed he threw an apple at Cletus's head and demanded a dagger or spear. The guards, not wanting to get in the middle of a fight between their emperor and his well-respected friend,
this is also why you don't get drunk where there are weapons available,
escorted Cletus out of the room. And that was that. Until somehow Cletus drunkenly made his way back into the room, loudly shouting a second course of insults he had come up with. Alexander, who, remember at this point, was also still drunk and pissed, decided that he had heard enough and grabbed a nearby javelin and threw it directly through Cletus's heart. Most records show that Alexander regretted this incident immediately and grieved for Cletus afterwards. Waking up to a drunk text you sent to your ex during a blackout is one thing, but what about waking up to having drunkenly murdered your friend with a javelin? Cletus had been a commander in service to the crown since before Alexander even took the throne. Not to mention he had saved him from certain death a number of years before.
It's amazing how you can have these people who can accomplish great and powerful things, but sometimes can become their own worst enemy.
Alas, once a javelin goes through the heart, there are generally no takebacks.
Right.
Number 5. William Clark of the Lewis and Clark Expedition. After the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, President Thomas Jefferson commissioned the Corps of Discovery Expedition, commonly known as the Lewis and Clark Expedition, which sent Captain Meriwether Lewis and his best bro William Clark along with a small crew on a multi-year mission to find a trade route through the newly acquired Western Front. Among the crew was just one
He called it the Western Front? That's interesting.
African American, Clark's personal slave, York, who was instrumental in the ultimate success of the expedition. But who was York, and what became of him when they returned? York was born enslaved and had been in service to Clark's family for almost his entire life. He was around the same age as Clark himself, so naturally he was designated as Clark's personal slave when they were both children.
And here, a pretty common thing, and I don't have any evidence to say that this is what happened in the case of York, but very often these enslaved people were the children of the slave owner. That was the case with my third great-grandmother. My third great-grandmother, her name was Cheney Caudle, and she was born into the Caudle family, who were her owners. And all the evidence seems to suggest that her owner was, in fact, her father. And so she was half, and she was mixed race, and yet was born enslaved. And so you have these enslaved children growing up who happen to be half-siblings to the white children of the slave-owning family, and they grow up side by side, and they might even initially kind of see themselves as equals until they're taught very quickly that they're not, in fact, equal. So it would have been interesting to see what the dynamic was between these two.
The two grew up together, learned valuable outdoor skills, and grew a deep but complicated bond. When Clark received the call from Lewis about the expedition, he decided to bring York along as his companion. During the expedition, York diligently stayed by his master's side throughout the entire ordeal. He faithfully worked, hunted, fought, and traveled with Clark and his men for the whole 3-year journey. His contributions went far beyond that of a general laborer. York helped Lewis and Clark deal peacefully with native tribes after the group had botched their first few interactions with the Native Americans. The tribes would be more at ease seeing a man with dark skin traveling with the party.
Yeah.
And eventually, when Lewis and Clark encountered a native group, the elders would instinctively begin talking with York first.
And it makes sense. Even though he doesn't look like the Native Americans, he doesn't look like the whites either. And you can see why this would communicate to these Native American tribes that these are tolerant people who may not be a threat to us, because look at one of their companions who looks differently.
As if he was the leader. Now, before you start typing in the comments, yes, the introduction of Sacagawea to the party obviously made native relations easier as well.
She wasn't there at the
She did
beginning.
not have contact with the expedition until the group had already been traveling for 9 months, so cool your jets. Clark even wrote about York's value to the party in his own personal writings, saying that York astonished the natives they encountered. As the journey progressed, so too did York's standing within the group. He was also allowed to hunt with a rifle, which slaves were not allowed to touch at the time, and even gained
Right.
voting rights amongst the crew when decisions needed to be made.
So it's kind of interesting to see how when you get outside of the laws of the nation, which allow for slavery, his status is still that of slave. But when you get outside of the culture and you get outside of the norms of what is acceptable and not acceptable, there does seem to be more equality. I'm not saying they were equals by any stretch of the imagination. More equality. You have people who otherwise might not get opportunities to be in positions of influence, like a teenage Native American girl, Sacagawea. And you have this enslaved man, York, and obviously they're not going to end up getting as much credit as Lewis and Clark, but in the heat of the moment, in the midst of everything that's going on, their contribution matters.
With this newfound acceptance, York began to see himself in a new light, as through his actions he slowly gained the respect of everyone in the crew.
And you would think that if you did that, you would think, oh, now they're really going to see me for who I am. Now they're really going to treat me as equals. Now I'm going to come back to the United States and I'm going to be seen as a hero, and I'll be given my freedom, and I'll be maybe advancing the cause. Now, none of that's going to happen. And similar, unfortunately, to things like the Harlem Hellfighters, the 369th Infantry during the First World War. They go over, and you could make a very good case that they were the best unit on the Western Front for the American Expeditionary Forces, an all-black unit from New York. And they think because they fought well, even though they were treated like second-class citizens by their own army, they were treated well by the French. And they think they're going to come home to a hero's welcome, and now everything's going to be different. And they come back to find out that's not the case.
Well, everyone except Clark, that is. After the successful completion of their expedition, York, newly empowered by what was undoubtedly a life-changing journey, asked his master for freedom. Clark, however, despite all they had been through, said no, and became frustrated that York even asked for such a thing. Which I guess is not surprising given the times, but still seems extra cruel considering he treated York like an equal for 3 years, when it benefited him only to act like nothing had changed when they returned. Every other member of the expedition was handsomely paid with money or land, but York, as a slave, received nothing. When York continued asking for his freedom, Clark grew angry and had him whipped, and then sent away to a harsher slave owner as punishment. There are some reports that Clark eventually did free York years later, but whether or not this is true or simply historical whitewashing, we'll never know.
I wonder what we do know about him, and that's something I'll maybe go dig into on my own a little bit. Maybe you can do the same and let us know in the comment section. But that was interesting. I thought it was really good. I thought he did a great job presenting that. I think that's the first time. But I've said that before. I've been like, oh, I've never reacted to this channel before. And then you guys instantly remind me that I did maybe 2 years ago or something. So as far as I know, I haven't done any reactions to this channel. But let me know if I'm wrong about that, but definitely check out Serious History and add to the conversation below. Let me know what you think, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.